The lights were bright, the cameras rolling, and millions of viewers tuned in expecting a routine interview. But what they witnessed instead shattered the script. Karoline Leavitt, facing Hollywood heavyweight Robert De Niro, and a visibly biased host, refused to back down. The tension in the room crackled as the audience began shifting, whispers turning into gasps. With the weight of the White House, the media, and public opinion pressing against her, Karoline stepped into the fire, and what she said would send shockwaves across the nation. This was not just a clash of opinions, it was a full-scale war for truth, reputation, and survival. Stay with us to see what happens next. The cameras had barely settled when the atmosphere inside the studio shifted, from casual curiosity to an electric buzz of tension. Millions of viewers, drawn in by the promise of a routine political exchange, leaned closer to their screens. They were expecting a conversation. They were about to witness a war. Karoline Leavitt, standing firm in the center of it all, was not just facing Robert De Niro, a Hollywood titan known for his fiery political rants. She was also staring down a media host clearly angling the conversation against her, subtly cutting her off, redirecting questions, and throwing softballs at De Niro. Even more dangerous, the audience itself, packed with celebrities, influencers, and powerful insiders, was visibly shifting, some nodding along with De Niro's smug jabs, others growing uncomfortable with the way Karoline was being boxed in. But Karoline? She refused to flinch. The tension was no longer just a battle of words. It had become a three-way battlefield. Karoline versus De Niro. Karoline versus a biased host desperate to control the narrative. Karoline versus a divided audience whose loyalties were cracking live in front of millions. The stakes could not have been higher. Public opinion, career reputations, future elections, everything simmered beneath the surface, waiting to explode with every word spoken. And through it all, Karoline knew one brutal truth, one wrong move, one slip, one misunderstood phrase, and her career could be shredded in seconds, broadcast live to the world, immortalized forever. But if she held her ground, if she turned the pressure into power, she would not just survive, she would ignite a movement. This was not just another viral clip waiting to die in the scroll of social media. This was a battle for credibility, truth, and the raw soul of the conversation between the governed and the governing. And as the first real shots were fired, verbal, sharp, strategic, one thing became crystal clear: no one would be able to look away. And if you think the beginning was explosive, you are going to want to stay to see what happens next. Before the storm that millions would later dissect frame by frame, it is important to understand the forces at play. Karoline Leavitt stood at the epicenter, young, fearless, and already a growing force in American political circles. A rising star, she carried the voice of a generation that felt abandoned by institutions, mocked by media, and silenced by elitist culture. To some, she was a symbol of boldness and truth. To others, she was a dangerous disruptor who needed to be discredited before she gained more ground. Robert De Niro, by contrast, was an institution unto himself, an Academy Award-winning actor, a Hollywood heavyweight, a cultural symbol who had, over the years, transformed from movie icon to outspoken political firebrand. His disdain for conservative America was no secret. His speeches, his interviews, even his red carpet moments, had often been less about art and more about activism. To millions, De Niro's voice still held sway, a battle-scarred general of the culture wars, unafraid to throw punches at anyone who threatened his ideological side. Between them, however, stood a third, subtler figure, the host. Dressed in polished neutrality, armed with a rehearsed smile, the host projected an image of fairness. But to a trained eye, or to anyone paying close attention, the bias seeped through. Questions to Karoline were sharpened like daggers, cutting her answers short. Questions to De Niro were soft landing pads, giving him space to launch attacks unchecked. The battlefield was not neutral, it was tilted, and Karoline knew it. Yet the psychological stakes towering over this moment were far greater than just bad moderation. Karoline was not just battling Robert De Niro. She was not just handling a hostile host. She was carrying the weight of an entire movement's hopes on her shoulders, a movement tired of being shouted down, laughed off, and silenced. She knew that behind the cameras, powerful media executives were watching, ready to clip her words, twist her meaning, and flood the internet with headlines if she stumbled. She knew advisors from the White House were watching too, assessing if she was a liability or a rising asset in the larger cultural chess game. She knew that public opinion, brutal, bloodthirsty, unforgiving, was always just one wrong word away from turning heroes into villains. And deeper still, Karoline faced an even quieter enemy, her own fear, the fear that maybe standing against giants would crush her, the fear that maybe truth was not enough anymore, the fear that the weight pressing down on her could break her before she ever got her chance to lead. But alongside that fear burned something stronger, a stubbornness, a belief that even in a rigged game you can still win if you refuse to fold, a belief that truth, when spoken boldly, cuts sharper than any lie. This moment, this interview, this clash, this battlefield, was no accident. It was the inevitable collision of two Americas, one desperate to cling to its cultural dominance, one rising from the ground, fists clenched, voice growing louder. Karoline knew exactly where she stood, and as the lights burned hotter, the cameras zoomed tighter, and the first questions pierced the air like missiles, she understood one more thing clearly. She had not come to survive this battle. She had come to win it, and the world was about to see exactly how far she was willing to go. The tension in the studio had been mounting, layer by layer, like a gathering storm. Karoline Leavitt sat poised, measured, her gaze unwavering. Robert De Niro lounged back slightly in his chair, a smug half-smile playing on his face, as if he already knew how this encounter would end. The host, still pretending neutrality, shuffled papers and leaned forward, setting the stage for the confrontation to come. It was a question designed not for clarity, but for chaos. "Ms. Leavitt," the host began, his voice smooth, almost syrupy, "how do you reconcile your support for individuals who many, including Mr. De Niro here, view as threats to democracy itself?" He smiled, tilting the platform perfectly toward De Niro, inviting the actor to pounce. De Niro did not hesitate. "Look," he said, waving a dismissive hand at Karoline, "you can put lipstick on a pig, but at the end of the day, the pig is still a pig." The audience chuckled, some politely, some eagerly. Karoline's face tightened almost imperceptibly, not in shock, not in fear, in focus. The host gave a little laugh, low and knowing, before quickly moving to De Niro again. "Would you like to elaborate on that?" As if the insult had been a well-reasoned point instead of a cheap jab. De Niro leaned in, the lights gleaming off his polished image. "These people," he said, voice dripping with contempt, "they want to drag us back into the dark ages, and frankly, giving them airtime is like giving matches to arsonists." Laughter rippled more boldly through the crowd now. A few clapped, a few whistled. Karoline did not move. She listened, and she waited. The host pressed on, emboldened. "Karoline, how do you respond to claims that your rhetoric fuels division rather than unity?" A classic loaded question, designed not to invite explanation but to paint her as guilty by default. In the second row, a man folded his arms and shook his head slowly. A woman whispered to her friend, glancing toward Karoline with narrowed eyes. Gasps, murmurs, subtle shifts in posture. The audience was tilting, and Karoline could feel it. For a flicker of a second, the whole room seemed to lean against her, an invisible weight pressing her deeper into her chair, trying to smother her before she could even draw breath. But that was the moment she had been waiting for. Karoline leaned slightly forward, folding her hands calmly on the table. "You know," she said, voice steady, "it is interesting how we are so quick to call for unity, right after delivering insults." The room tensed. Not a loud reaction, not yet, but the breathing shifted, the eyes sharpened, the smiles tightened. De Niro smirked again, clearly underestimating the fire about to be unleashed. "Mr. De Niro," Karoline continued, voice firm but measured, "I respect your career. I grew up watching your movies, but I do not remember democracy being strengthened by punching presidents or insulting voters." The host opened his mouth, perhaps to interrupt, but Karoline kept going, unstoppable now. "The people you mock, the ones you dismiss as pigs, are the same people who bought your movie tickets, who believed in the American dream you once portrayed on screen." Someone in the third row gasped audibly. 2 rows behind them, a woman whispered, "She has a point." Karoline's eyes locked onto De Niro's. Fearless, "You call it progress to belittle half the country?" She paused, let the silence expand. Weapon eyes burned through the air like a slow explosion. "Maybe the real danger to democracy is not who you fear, It is what you have become. For a heartbeat, the studio froze. Even the host blinked, caught between his role as moderator and his instinct to protect the more famous guest. De Niro leaned back slightly, visibly thrown off by the sharpness, the calm intensity of her attack, and, just like that, the audience energy cracked. Some clapped, unsure at first, then louder. Someone shouted, "Let her speak!" A cluster of young people near the side stage whooped and hollered. Even a few journalists in the press box lowered their pens and looked up, no longer scribbling scripted hit pieces but witnessing something real. Karoline sat back slowly, never breaking eye contact with either De Niro or the host. The power in the room had shifted. The ground beneath the Hollywood elite was no longer solid. The battle lines had been redrawn, and Karoline Leavitt was no longer defending herself. She was winning, and everyone could feel it. For a moment there was silence. Real silence. Not the polite kind that fills awkward interviews. The kind of silence that demands something is about to happen. Something unforgettable. Karoline inhaled slowly, her gaze razor sharp. Her hands rested lightly on the table, a picture of calm under fire. The whole studio, from the host to the back row of the audience, leaned forward unconsciously, and then she spoke. "Mr. De Niro," she began, voice cool and unwavering, "it is funny. You built a career playing heroes who fought injustice, fighters, leaders, men who stood tall when everything around them crumbled." A slow pause. But somewhere along the way, you decided that shouting insults from a stage was the same thing as courage. The first ripple went through the audience, a slight shifting, an energy change, barely visible but very real. "You were a Hollywood icon," Karoline continued, her tone sharpening. "Now you are just playing outrage for applause." The words slammed into the room. A gasp, sharp and real, sliced across the front rows. De Niro's eyebrows twitched slightly. The host darted his eyes toward the control booth, as if begging for a way out. Karoline leaned forward an inch. "You call people like me dangerous," she said, "because we dare to believe that loving your country is not something to be ashamed of." Another pause, another dagger twist. "You call us extremists, but when was the last time you walked through the neighborhoods you mock?" Her voice stayed calm, almost dangerously calm. Whispers bloomed across the audience now. Someone coughed, loudly. Another person muttered, "She's right," under their breath. Karoline pressed on. "You made a career off the backs of ordinary Americans, the factory workers, the farmers, the soldiers, the very people you now sneer at as backward and broken." She shook her head lightly, almost in sadness. "You played them on screen, but you forgot them in real life." Another body blow. De Niro's mouth opened, but Karoline was faster. "We did not forget," she said, her voice rising just slightly, just enough to fill the room. "We remember the values you used to pretend to defend. Hard work, family, faith, freedom. Those are not relics of a forgotten era. They are the foundation you are now standing on while throwing stones at everyone beneath you." The first clap started, a slow rhythmic pattering. The host leaned in nervously. "Karoline, let's be civil here." But Karoline's eyes flashed like lightning. "Civil?" she repeated, smiling tightly. "I am being civil. I am being respectful, which is more than I can say for someone who calls millions of Americans pigs just because they dare to disagree." The audience roared louder, gasps blending into applause. A few cheers broke out. "You see," Karoline said, now standing up, her energy filling the space, "this is not about politics anymore. This is about who gets to speak and who gets silenced." Her hand moved lightly through the air, as if slicing invisible walls down. "For too long, people like you have stood in front of cameras and decided who was allowed to be heard, who was allowed to be respected, who was allowed to be American enough. But we are not asking for your permission anymore." Boom. The crowd cracked open. A standing ovation began on the right side of the studio. "You do not have to like me," Karoline said, nodding toward De Niro. "You do not even have to listen to me, but you will not erase me. You will not shame me into silence. You will not pretend that your money, your fame, and your awards give you moral authority over the millions of hard-working Americans you mock from your golden stages." De Niro tried to chuckle, tried to dismiss her with a wave of his hand, but his smile faltered when the audience cheered louder. Karoline paced slightly now, a general on the battlefield, calm, commanding, undeniable. "And let us be clear about one thing," she said, pausing mid-step, voice dropping lower, cutting through the applause like a blade. "We are not the danger to democracy. We are its defenders. Applause shook the floor. Because democracy dies, she continued, voice rising, not when people speak freely, not when they argue, not when they protest. Another beat, another pause. Democracy dies when fear silences free thought, when the powerful mock the powerless, when the loudest voices drown out the ones that built this nation from the ground up. A veteran near the front stood up, hand over heart. You call yourself brave for speaking out, Karoline said, staring straight at De Niro now. But bravery is not standing in a studio with a safe audience clapping on cue. Bravery is speaking truth when the whole world is ready to tear you down for it. Tears glimmered in the eyes of a few audience members now. Some clutched each other's hands, nodding silently. Karoline paused again, her final weaponized silence. We remember who you were, she said, voice almost breaking into tenderness. We just wish you did too. The final line hung in the air, like a funeral bell. For 3 heartbeats, there was only silence. And then, the room detonated. Standing ovation, shouts, cheers. The camera operators even forgot to keep the framing steady for a moment. The host sat back helplessly, knowing he had lost total control. De Niro stared, his mouth slightly open, unsure if he had just lost a debate or a war. Phones lifted everywhere. Live tweets exploded across the internet. Clips were already being edited, sent, shared, viralized. Karoline smiled softly, humbly, and returned to her seat. The calm in the middle of the storm she had unleashed. She had not just survived, she had conquered, and the world would never forget what had just happened inside that studio. For a few seconds after Karoline's final words, the studio froze. It was not the polite silence of people waiting for the next segment. It was the heavy, stunned silence of a room realizing it had just witnessed something that could not be undone. Then, like a dam breaking, the crowd surged to its feet in a thunderous standing ovation. People clapped with such force their hands reddened. Whistles pierced the air. Cheers erupted from every corner of the room. What had started as a skeptical, divided audience had flipped entirely. They were no longer passive observers. They were participants in a moment that would ripple far beyond the walls of the studio. Outside that building, reality shifted even faster. As Karoline gathered her papers with calm precision, phones across the country buzzed and lit up. On X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, hashtags exploded into the trending charts. Leavitt mic-drop, De Niro demolished, truth over fame. TikTok feeds flooded with edits. Karoline's savage one-liners layered over cinematic music, slow motion, cuts of De Niro's stunned expression, fiery text that screamed, "This is America." Within 20 minutes, the internet had become an unstoppable wildfire. The memes came next. One viral image captured De Niro's frozen face right after Karoline's final blow with the caption, "When you realize the script was not written for you this time." Another edit placed old movie scenes of De Niro's characters standing proud next to real-time footage of him sitting defeated, while bold letters flashed, "From silver screens to silent defeats." Reaction videos poured onto YouTube, racking up millions of views in mere hours. Titles like, "Karoline Leavitt just ended Robert De Niro live. Watch this," and "The moment Hollywood lost the room," dominated recommendation pages everywhere. But the internet storm was not just about memes and claps. Emotional reactions poured out across the country, captured in living rooms, diners, dorm rooms, and subway stations. In an Ohio diner, a group of factory workers replayed Karoline's speech over and over between sips of coffee and bites of burgers, laughing and cheering louder each time she landed another brutal line. In a small Texas town, a family gathered around their television, the father nodding slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. In a college dorm in Florida, students from opposite political backgrounds high-fived and laughed, momentarily united by the rare sight of authenticity. On national television, the emotional resonance was real, and it was everywhere. Meanwhile, expert commentary lit up news channels like fireworks. Analysts scrambled to define what had just happened. One political strategist on cable news said bluntly, "Karoline Leavitt did not just win an argument. She shattered a narrative. She reminded millions that courage does not require a Hollywood budget." On another network, a cultural analyst observed, "In a society driven by staged outrage and curated victimhood, Authentic defiance hits harder than any scripted performance. And that is exactly what America saw tonight. Even neutral and previously dismissive media outlets were forced to cover the eruption. Headlines screamed across morning editions and late-night broadcasts alike. Leavitt versus De Niro, the viral showdown that redefined the narrative. Old guard journalists, the ones who had scoffed at Karoline only months ago, found themselves rewriting their scripts just to stay relevant in the new conversation. The emotional cutaways were relentless. Videos surfaced of a mother in Kansas, wiping away tears as she watched Karoline's speech alone at her kitchen table. A veteran in Pennsylvania posted a selfie, hand over heart, with the caption, "For the first time in years, I believe someone heard us." Across rural farms, bustling cities, suburban neighborhoods, the divide between the elite and the everyday had been exposed, and Karoline had drawn a bright, bold line through it. By midnight, major polls showed seismic shifts, approval ratings, favorability charts, engagement metrics. Everything pointed to one simple truth. The elites had underestimated her, the media had miscalculated her, the people had embraced her, and as Karoline stepped into the cool night air outside the studio, no security guards, no entourage, just a young woman armed with courage. The headlines blazed across every screen behind her. She had not just survived Hollywood's best shot, she had flipped the script, and the world would not forget. The sun had barely risen the next morning when headlines screamed from every device in America. Leavitt crushes De Niro in viral showdown. Hollywood elite versus Heartland America, and the Heartland won. Mic drop heard across the nation. Every news cycle, every trending feed, every coffee shop conversation buzzed with the same story. Karoline Leavitt had not just survived a live confrontation designed to humiliate her. She had turned it into a cultural earthquake. Major political commentators scrambled to adjust their narratives. Some tried desperately to spin it. De Niro just had a bad night. Karoline's words were out of context. But the damage was done. Every honest voice admitted what millions had seen with their own eyes. Authenticity had beaten performance. Truth had stood taller than scripted outrage. Across the political landscape, the impact was immediate. Pollsters reported a dramatic 14% spike in Karoline's national favorability overnight, a surge so large that even hardened analysts struggled to explain it. Key demographic groups, independents, young voters, suburban families, all showed massive shifts in her direction. Conservative circles hailed her as the new vanguard of the movement. Moderates admired her composure under pressure. Even some progressives privately admitted respect for the way she handled the unfiltered assault. Meanwhile, Robert De Niro's public image took a noticeable hit. Social media, once his stronghold of adoring fans, flooded with memes mocking his stunned silence, his arrogance unraveling live on air. His defenders, usually loud and numerous, grew unusually quiet. For the first time in years, De Niro faced not admiration, but uncomfortable questions. And the media itself? It fractured. Legacy outlets, desperate to maintain credibility, rushed to cover Karoline's moment, interviewing her allies, dissecting her speech, replaying her mic drop moments on endless loops. The usual gatekeepers, the ones who decided who was worthy of airtime, found themselves chasing a story they had no control over. Late-night comedians, once quick to mock conservative voices, found themselves awkwardly skipping over Karoline's name, knowing jokes would not land when millions saw bravery instead of bluster. News panels held emergency discussions. Is a political realignment underway? Can authenticity defeat celebrity culture? In small towns and big cities alike, watch parties sprung up. People who had never heard of Karoline before were now sharing her quotes like gospel. You cannot lead a country you despise. We are not the danger to democracy. We are its heartbeat. Her words were not just viral, they were becoming foundational. Politicians on both sides took notice. Campaigns scrambled to adjust their messaging. Consultants warned candidates that fake passion, staged outrage, and carefully curated personas would no longer cut it. The public had tasted something real, and they were hungry for more. Karoline herself stayed almost silent for 24 hours after the interview. No gloating tweets, no flashy victory laps, just a simple message pinned to her profile. Truth wins. That restraint, that refusal to ride the hype machine, only fueled the fire more. By the end of the week, she had been invited onto major talk shows, featured on the covers of political magazines, and booked to speak at rallies where tens of thousands gathered, not just to cheer her name but to celebrate the spirit she had revived. The backlash existed, of course. Old guard media voices warned darkly about radical populism. Hollywood elites issued thinly veiled criticisms. A few tried desperately to dig into her past, searching for anything to discredit her rise, but none of it stuck, because the public had seen the truth with their own eyes, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Karoline's clash with Robert De Niro was no longer just an interview. It had become a defining moment, a cultural pivot point where old narratives cracked and new ones took root. It was the moment authenticity beat arrogance, the moment courage eclipsed celebrity, the moment a young woman with nothing but a microphone and her convictions changed the story being told about America. And as the country looked toward the future, one thing was certain. Karoline Leavitt was no longer just a name. She was a movement. The aftershocks of that night rippled far beyond the bright lights of the studio. They raced across the internet, through living rooms, coffee shops, and quiet offices, stirring something many thought had been lost. Belief. Belief that a voice, without Hollywood money, without coastal elite backing, could still rise and cut through the static. Belief that authenticity, raw and unapologetic, still had the power to tilt the earth beneath carefully scripted lies. Karoline Leavitt's moment had been more than a viral mic drop. It was a cultural explosion, a flashpoint where millions saw themselves reflected not in the polished images of celebrities or the calculated speeches of politicians, but in the steady eyes of a young woman who refused to be shamed into silence. It was a collision of two worlds, one clinging desperately to old hierarchies of fame and scripted outrage, the other roaring back with the raw, untamed energy of truth. The battle lines had been drawn. The elites who once mocked the heartland realized they no longer owned the narrative. The legacy media that once dictated winners and losers saw the ground shifting under their feet, and ordinary people, too long dismissed and diminished, found a champion who did not just speak for them, she embodied them. Karoline did not gloat. She did not dance on the ruins she had left behind. She simply walked off that stage, calm, focused, unstoppable, the embodiment of quiet, furious determination. And as she disappeared into the dark corridors behind the studio, history moved with her. At that exact moment, across newsrooms and digital feeds, a breaking alert began flashing red across every major outlet. Breaking: national polls show Trump. Support surges 12% overnight. Following Leavitt interview, experts warned political landscape could shift rapidly. The message was clear. The war was not over. It had only just begun. Somewhere beyond the headlines and hashtags, in the stillness that follows every great upheaval, the future was stirring, hungry, restless, and no longer willing to be ignored. And Karoline Leavitt, once underestimated, once laughed at, was no longer just part of the story. She was rewriting it.